The gunshot echoed across the desert like thunder, sending a flock of ravens spiraling into the crimson Arizona sky. Emmett Thompson pressed his small frame against the weathered fence post, his weathered hands gripping the Winchester rifle as sweat dripped from beneath his hat brim. The Apache war party had been tracking him for 3 days, and now they had found his ranch. He squinted through the dust cloud rising from the valley below, counting at least 6 riders circling his property like vultures. His cattle were scattered, bellowing in terror as the warriors drove them toward the canyon. Everything he had worked for during the past 5 years was about to disappear in a matter of hours. But today was also the day she was supposed to arrive. Emmett cursed under his breath, remembering the letter folded in his shirt pocket. Willa Mackenzie would be stepping off the afternoon stage in Red Mesa, expecting to meet her future husband, not knowing he might already be dead. The irony wasn't lost on him that after months of lonely correspondence, fate had chosen this moment to test whether their union was meant to be. The sound of hoofbeats approached from behind. Emmett spun around, rifle raised, only to see Fletcher Knox's familiar weathered face emerging from the smoke. "Emmett! Thank God you're alive," Fletcher called out, dismounting his horse with urgency. The Apache hit the Morrison place at dawn. Burned it to the ground. Tommy's missing, and his wife. Fletcher's voice trailed off, his expression saying everything that words couldn't. "How many are we dealing with?" Emmett asked, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "More than we can handle alone. Sheriff's organizing a posse, but it'll take hours. Problem is, your lady friend is due on that stage in 30 minutes, and those warriors are between here and town." Emmett felt his stomach drop. Willa would be stepping into a war zone, completely unaware of the danger. After 6 months of careful letters, sharing dreams and hopes across 1,000 miles, she would arrive to find either a dead man or an empty town. "I have to get to her," Emmett said, checking his ammunition. "You'll never make it in time. Those Apache know every trail between here and Red Mesa. Besides, look at yourself, man. You're barely 5'4" and weigh less than a sack of grain. What exactly do you plan to do against a war party?" Fletcher's words stung because they held truth. Emmett had always been small, even as a boy back in Missouri. His father had called him "runt" until the day he died, never believing his youngest son could handle ranch life. But here in Arizona, away from family expectations and childhood taunts, Emmett had found something resembling peace. The land didn't care about his size. The cattle didn't judge him. And through his letters with Willa, he had discovered a woman who seemed to see past such trivial concerns. Or so he had believed. The truth was, neither of them had been entirely honest in their correspondence. Emmett had written about his ranch, his dreams, his loneliness, but had carefully avoided any physical descriptions. He had assumed Willa was doing the same out of modesty, never imagining there might be other reasons for such omissions. Another gunshot cracked through the air, closer this time. Through the haze, Emmett could see flames beginning to lick at his barn. His horses were trapped inside, their terrified whinnying echoing across the compound. "We need to move, now," Fletcher urged. "Forget the woman. She's probably better off not finding you today anyway." But Emmett was already running toward the burning barn, his small legs carrying him faster than Fletcher had ever seen him move. He kicked open the doors, releasing 3 horses into the yard before the roof collapsed behind him. Smoke and ash covered his clothes as he emerged, coughing but determined. "I'm not abandoning her," he said firmly. "And I'm not abandoning my home." Fletcher shook his head but reached for his own rifle. "Then I guess we make our stand here. Though I have to say, this isn't exactly the welcome party your bride was probably expecting." The war cries grew louder as the Apache riders approached the main house. Emmett positioned himself behind an overturned wagon, his heart pounding as he thought about the woman who would soon be looking for him. What would Willa Mackenzie think when she arrived in Red Mesa to find it under siege? Would she turn around and head back east on the next stage, or would she somehow find a way to reach him? He had no way of knowing that at that very moment, Willa was indeed stepping off the afternoon stage, but the sight that greeted her was unlike anything either of them could have imagined. At nearly 6 feet tall and built like a lumberjack, she towered over every person in the small crowd gathered at the station. The other passengers stepped aside instinctively as she emerged, her massive frame blocking out the sun. But more shocking than her imposing size was what she was carrying, a rifle nearly as tall as Emmett himself, and the kind of confidence that suggested she knew exactly how to use it. The station master, a nervous man named Murphy, approached her cautiously. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been some trouble. Apache war party hit the area this morning. Most folks are staying indoors until the cavalry arrives." Willa set down her single carpetbag and surveyed the nearly deserted street. "I'm looking for Emmett Thompson. He has a ranch outside of town." Murphy's face went pale. "Thompson's place?" "Ma'am, that's exactly where the trouble is. Last we heard, they were burning him out. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but your husband is probably dead." For a moment, something flickered across Willa's face, an emotion too complex to name. Then her jaw set with determination that would have impressed any man twice her size. "He's not my husband yet," she said simply. "And I don't believe he's dead until I see it for myself." Without waiting for Murphy's protests, Willa shouldered her rifle and began walking in the direction of the Thompson ranch. Her massive strides covered ground quickly, and several townspeople watched from their windows as the giant woman disappeared into the desert haze, walking straight toward the sound of gunfire. Back at the ranch, Emmett had no idea that his salvation might be approaching in the most unexpected form possible. As he squeezed off another shot at the circling Apache, he wondered if he would live long enough to meet the woman whose letters had sustained him through the loneliest months of his life. He had no way of knowing that Willa Mackenzie was not only alive and well, but was at that very moment loading her rifle and preparing to announce her arrival in a way that would change both their lives forever. The war cries grew closer, and Emmett prepared for what might be his final stand, unaware that the most dangerous thing on the Arizona desert that day was not the Apache war party, but a 6-foot-tall woman with nothing left to lose and a very clear idea of what she wanted. The Apache warrior never saw what hit him. One moment he was circling Emmett's burning barn on horseback, war paint streaking his face as he prepared to deliver the final blow to the small rancher cowering behind the overturned wagon. The next moment, a rifle shot rang out from the ridge behind him, and he toppled from his horse like a felled tree. Emmett blinked through the smoke and dust, certain he was hallucinating from heat exhaustion. Standing silhouetted against the afternoon sun was the largest human being he had ever seen, and it appeared to be wearing a dress. The figure was reloading a rifle with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of years on the frontier, movements smooth and deadly despite the feminine clothing. Fletcher Knox, crouched behind a water trough 20 yards away, whistled low under his breath. "Well, I'll be damned. Is that your mail-order bride, Emmett?" Before Emmett could answer, another Apache rider came charging around the side of the house, tomahawk raised. The giant figure on the ridge didn't even seem to hurry as they raised the rifle again, tracked the moving target, and fired. The warrior's horse continued its charge, but the saddle was now empty. "Jesus Christ," Fletcher muttered. "She shoots better than half the men in the territory." The remaining Apache warriors had noticed their new adversary as well. 2 of them wheeled their horses toward the ridge, but the massive woman was already moving, covering ground with surprising speed for someone her size. She reached a cluster of rocks just as the riders came within range, using the natural fortification like she had been born to guerrilla warfare. Emmett found himself staring not just at her size, which was considerable, but at the way she moved. There was nothing clumsy or awkward about her despite her imposing frame. She flowed like water around the rocky terrain, always seeming to be exactly where she needed to be when she needed to be there. Her red hair had come loose from whatever arrangement she had started with, and it now streamed behind her like a battle flag as she repositioned for another shot. The Apache, sensing that the tide of battle had shifted, began to withdraw. But not before their leader, a scarred warrior with eagle feathers in his hair, rode close enough to the rocks where the woman had taken cover to get a good look at her. What he saw there made him pull up short, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. She had stood up to face him directly, all 6 feet of her clearly visible above the stone barrier. Her rifle was aimed squarely at his chest, but she wasn't firing. Instead, she was speaking to him in what sounded like fluent Apache, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air even though Emmett couldn't understand the words. The warrior's response was equally incomprehensible to the ranchers, but his tone suggested surprise and perhaps even respect. The conversation lasted nearly a full minute, with the woman never lowering her rifle and the Apache never making any aggressive moves. Finally, the warrior nodded once, called out something to his remaining men, and led them away from the ranch at a gallop. Emmett and Fletcher waited in stunned silence until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before emerging from their positions. The woman was already walking down from the ridge, her rifle held casually in one hand like it weighed no more than a walking stick. Up close, her size was even more impressive. She stood at least 6 inches taller than any man in Red Mesa, with shoulders that could have belonged to a lumberjack and hands that looked capable of splitting firewood barehanded. But her face was undeniably feminine, with strong features and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. "You must be Emmett Thompson," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that might have been Irish or Scottish. "I'm Willa Mackenzie. Sorry I'm late." Fletcher looked back and forth between the tiny rancher and the Amazon who had just saved their lives, clearly struggling with the mathematics of their size difference. "Ma'am, I don't mean to be rude, but exactly how did you know where to find us? And how the hell did you talk those Apache into leaving?" Willa set her rifle down and began checking the wounded cattle that had scattered during the attack. "The man at the stage station told me there was trouble out here. As for the Apache, their leader recognized me. We've met before." Emmett found his voice finally, though it came out smaller than he intended. "Met before? Ma'am, how could you have met Apache warriors? You just arrived from back east." A shadow crossed Willa's face, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked less than completely confident. "That's not exactly true, Emmett. I haven't been entirely honest in my letters." She walked over to where his barn had been, surveying the smoldering remains with the eye of someone who understood construction. "I haven't come from back east. I've been living in Arizona Territory for 3 years now. Up in the mountains near Fort Apache." Fletcher's eyes widened. "Fort Apache? That's deep in hostile territory. What in God's name were you doing up there?" "My husband was a translator for the army. Half Apache himself, though he never talked much about that side of his family. When he was killed in a skirmish 2 years ago, his Apache relatives took me in rather than let me starve. I learned their language, their customs. Learned to hunt and fight the way they do." Emmett felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about Willa Mackenzie was proving to be wrong. "But your letters, you wrote about losing your family back in Ohio. About wanting to start fresh." "I did lose my family. My husband was my family. And I do want to start fresh." She turned to face him directly, and he had to crane his neck back to meet her eyes. "But I also needed to know what kind of man I was coming to meet. A man who would accept me for who I really am, not who he imagined me to be." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Emmett's mind was racing, trying to reconcile the gentle, somewhat naive woman from the letters with this frontier Amazon who had just saved his life and spoke Apache like a native. "There's something else," Willa continued, her voice softening slightly. "The Apache who was leading that war party is named Nailnish. He was my husband's cousin. When he saw me here, protecting you, he understood that I had chosen a new path. But he also warned me that there are other war parties in the area, ones that don't know me and won't show the same restraint." Fletcher spat into the dust. "Meaning this ranch isn't safe anymore. Meaning none of the isolated ranches are safe right now. The Apache are being pushed harder by the army, and they're getting desperate. They'll hit every settlement they can before winter comes." Emmett looked around at what remained of his property. The barn was a total loss, several head of cattle were missing or dead, and his house had taken damage from stray bullets and fire arrows. But the bones of the ranch were still there, and more importantly, he was still alive. "So what do you suggest?" he asked, surprised to hear himself deferring to her judgment. "We rebuild. But we rebuild smart. Make this place into a fortress that can withstand a siege if necessary. And we convince some of the other ranchers to do the same, create a network of strong points that can support each other." Fletcher shook his head. That's assuming the other ranchers will take advice from. He paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase his objection diplomatically. From a woman who's twice the size of their wives and talks to Apache warriors like old friends? Willa finished for him, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Yes, that might be a challenge. Emmett found himself studying her profile as she gazed out at the desert. There was something almost regal about the way she carried herself, as if her size wasn't a burden but a kind of natural authority. He realized that despite everything that had happened, despite all the surprises and revelations, he was more intrigued by her now than he had been when she was just words on paper. "There's something I need to ask you," he said finally. "In your letters, you never mentioned being married before. Or living with the Apache. Or being able to shoot like Annie Oakley. Were any of the things you wrote about yourself true?" Willa was quiet for a long moment, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "The important things were true. I am lonely. I do want to build something lasting with someone I can trust. I am tired of living on the edges of other people's lives." She looked down at him then, and he could see vulnerability beneath all that strength. "But I also know that most men would run screaming if they knew the whole truth about me. So I told you the parts one thought you could handle. And what made you think I could handle them now? Because you're still here. Because when the shooting started, you didn't run. Because you saved your horses before you saved yourself." She gestured toward the 3 animals now grazing peacefully near what remained of the water trough. "A man who puts helpless animals before his own safety is someone I can trust with the truth." Fletcher cleared his throat. "Not to interrupt this tender moment, but we've got practical matters to consider. Emmett, you can't stay out here alone anymore. And ma'am, I don't know what your sleeping arrangements were supposed to be, but given the circumstances—" "I'll stay in town tonight," Willa said quickly. "But tomorrow, I'd like to come back and help with the rebuilding. If you'll have me." Emmett looked around at the destruction, then back at the woman who had appeared out of nowhere to save his life. Nothing about this situation was what he had planned or expected. But then again, nothing about his life in Arizona had gone according to plan, and somehow it had still turned out better than anything he had known back in Missouri. "There's a spare room in the house," he heard himself saying. "It's not much, but the roof is intact and there's a lock on the door. You're welcome to stay there while we figure things out." Fletcher's eyebrows shot up, but he kept his opinions to himself. "That's generous of you," Willa said. "But people will talk." "People are going to talk anyway," Emmett replied, surprising himself with his directness. "A woman your size and a man my size trying to make a go of it together? We're going to be the subject of gossip from here to Tucson regardless of our sleeping arrangements." For the first time since her arrival, Willa laughed. It was a rich, warm sound that seemed to chase away some of the day's violence. "You know, Emmett Thompson, I think you might be exactly the man I was hoping to find when I answered your advertisement." As the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the 3 of them walked toward the damaged but still standing house. Behind them, smoke still rose from the ruins of the barn, but ahead lay the promise of something neither Emmett nor Willa had quite dared to imagine when they first began their careful correspondence months ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the Apache threat was far from over. But for tonight, they were alive, they were together, and they were beginning to understand that sometimes the most unexpected combinations create the strongest foundations. Fletcher Knox, walking slightly behind them, couldn't help but grin as he watched the tiny rancher and the giant woman discussing plans for fortifying the ranch. He had seen a lot of strange things in his 30 years on the frontier, but he had a feeling that the courtship of Emmett Thompson and Willa Mackenzie was going to be something worth watching. And in the distance, barely visible in the gathering dusk, Nailnish sat on his horse atop a rocky outcrop, observing the unlikely trio as they disappeared into the house. His cousin's widow had chosen her path, and he would honor that choice. But he would also watch over her, as family should, to ensure that this small man proved worthy of the remarkable woman who had decided to trust him with her future. The desert wind carried the scent of smoke and possibility as night fell over the Thompson ranch, and somewhere in the darkness, the sound of hammering began as 3 people worked together to rebuild what had been lost and create something entirely new.